It was the summer of 1980, and a team of engineers from IBM arrived at a small company in Pacific Grove, California. They carried briefcases, wore suits, and had driven up from a hotel 30 miles down the coast. They had signed non-disclosure agreements before making the drive, and they were there to offer the founder of that company something that, in retrospect, should have made him one of the most powerful people in the history of the technology industry. He wasn't there. What happened next? In the hours that followed that empty parking space, in the negotiations that unraveled, in the panicked calls IBM made afterward to a company in Albuquerque run by someone they had almost dismissed as a middleman, is the story of how the entire personal computer industry was shaped not by the best technology or the best engineer, but by a single question of who was in the room when it mattered. And Gary Kildall, who in 1980 was arguably the most important software developer alive, was not in that room. And that absence cost him everything. Understanding what was lost requires understanding what Gary Kildall had built, and how improbable it was that he had built it at all. In 1973, Kildall was a computer science professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He was 31 years old, exceptionally gifted, and deeply uninterested in the academic formalities that surrounded him. He had access to one of the first Intel microprocessors in the 8008, a chip so primitive it could barely be called a computer, and he had an idea. What if you could write software that allowed a microprocessor to interact with peripheral devices, a disk drive, a teletype terminal, without the programmer having to rewrite low-level hardware instructions every time? What if the operating layer, the interface between software and machine, could be standardized? The idea seems obvious now. It was not obvious then. In 1973, the concept of a personal computer, a machine owned and operated by a single individual, was science fiction to almost everyone in the computing industry. The people who owned computers were governments, universities, and corporations. The machines lived in climate-controlled rooms. You submitted programs on punch cards and retrieved results hours later. The idea that someone would want a computer on a desk for personal use was considered eccentric at best. Kildall wrote his operating system in a language he had largely developed himself. He called it CPM, Control Program for Microcomputers. In 1974, he persuaded Intel to let him use their new 8080 chip to demonstrate it. The demonstration worked. Kildall and his wife Dorothy McEwen, who was as much a business partner as a spouse, started a company they called Digital Research Incorporated. They began selling CPM through the mail. By 1977, the world had changed around them faster than anyone had anticipated. Apple had released the Apple II. Tandy had the TRS-80. The MITS Altair had created a hobbyist market that nobody in the mainstream computing industry had believed was real, and almost every one of these machines needed an operating system to be genuinely useful. CPM was not the only option, but it was the best option. By 1980, hundreds of programs ran on CPM. Hundreds of thousands of machines ran CPM. Kildall was not rich by Silicon Valley standards. Digital Research was a small company in a beach town, but he had built something foundational. The personal computer industry, insofar as it had an operating system, was running on software he had written 7 years earlier in a rented office with borrowed hardware. And then IBM got serious about personal computers. The story of why IBM got serious and why they got serious in a hurry is its own complicated history. The simplified version is this. IBM had spent decades as the unchallenged giant of the computing world and had watched the personal computer market emerge and decided it was beneath them. Then Apple's sales numbers started arriving, and the projections for where those numbers were going made IBM's board of directors extremely nervous. In 1980, IBM authorized an internal project, deliberately hidden from IBM's own bureaucracy, because IBM's own bureaucracy would have killed it, to build a personal computer. The project had 1 year to ship a product. 1 year is not long enough to design a custom microprocessor, so IBM decided to build around Intel's 8088 chip, which they could buy off the shelf. 1 year is not long enough to write an operating system, so IBM needed to buy one of those too. The team doing the buying knew exactly who to call. Gary Kildall had the dominant operating system for personal computers. CPM ran on Intel architecture. The meeting seemed almost like a formality. The IBM team arrived in Pacific Grove in August 1980. What happened next has been argued about ever since. The version that became legend, the version IBM preferred, and that the business press eventually canonized, was that Kildall simply wasn't there. He had gone flying in his private plane. The IBM team waited. Dorothy McEwen met with them but refused to sign their non-disclosure agreement. The meeting collapsed. IBM drove back down the coast. Kildall's version, which he was still arguing about when he died, was more complicated. He says he did meet with IBM that day, that the real problem was IBM's non-disclosure agreement, which was unusually broad and would have given IBM rights to technologies well beyond any operating system deal, and that Digital Research's lawyers had legitimate reasons to object. He says the negotiation continued for weeks after that initial meeting before finally breaking down over licensing terms. He says he was never given a fair chance. The truth is probably somewhere between these accounts, and it may never be fully recoverable. What is recoverable is what IBM did next. They called Bill Gates. Gates was 24 years old and ran a small software company in Albuquerque called Microsoft. Microsoft's primary product was programming language tools, basic interpreters for personal computers. Gates had no operating system, but when IBM called, Gates did not say that. He said he could help. Then he called around and found someone who did have one. Tim Patterson, an engineer at a company called Seattle Computer Products, had written a CP/M clone, a functional imitation of Kildall's system designed to run on Intel's 8086 architecture. Patterson called it QDOS, which stood for Quick and Dirty Operating System. The name was not a boast. Gates bought it for $50,000. Seattle Computer Products did not know they were selling it to someone who would be licensing it to IBM. That detail, which was either brilliant strategy or straightforward deception, depending on who you ask, would matter a great deal later. What mattered most, though, was the licensing structure Gates negotiated with IBM. IBM offered to buy the operating system outright. Gates refused. Instead, he licensed it. Microsoft retained ownership. IBM got the right to use it. IBM, which was in a hurry and had enormous confidence in its own brand, agreed. They assumed that their name on the box was the product. They assumed nobody would buy a cheap IBM clone. They assumed, in other words, that the machine was what mattered. Gates understood something they did not. Once the software was standardized and the hardware was commoditized, the software would become the leverage point. Forever. IBM introduced the IBM PC in August 1981. It ran Microsoft's operating system, now called PC-DOS. The machine was an enormous commercial success, and the open architecture IBM had chosen, because they were in a hurry, not because they believed in open ecosystems, meant that clone manufacturers immediately began producing cheaper IBM-compatible machines. Those machines needed an operating system too. They licensed it from Microsoft, which had kept the rights. PC-DOS became MS-DOS. MS-DOS became the foundation of Windows. Windows became the operating system that ran the majority of the world's personal computers for the next 3 decades. Gary Kildall watched this happen. He tried to compete. Digital Research eventually released CP/M86, an update designed to run on Intel's 8086 chip. IBM offered it as an option on the IBM PC for $240 more than MS-DOS. Almost nobody bought it. The market had standardized around Microsoft's version before Digital Research's version was finished. Kildall spent years arguing that MS-DOS was an illegal copy of CP/M, that it was too similar to be coincidental, that the architecture of the code was identical to his in ways that no independent developer would have replicated. He was probably right. The legal question was never definitively resolved. Microsoft settled various disputes over the years without admitting wrongdoing. By the mid-1980s, Digital Research was no longer the center of the personal computer world. Kildall sold the company to Novell in 1991. He received a reported $80 million, which was a fraction of what he would have had if any of several different decisions had gone differently in 1980. He was not destitute, but he was 49 years old and had watched the industry he created be taken from him in a conference room by people who understood the business differently than he did. He never stopped being bitter about it. In interviews, in private, in a memoir he was writing at the time of his death, he tried to set the record straight. He was, by many accounts, difficult to be around in his final years. Brilliant and frustrated and convinced that history had done him a profound injustice. That conviction was not unreasonable. In July 1994, Gary Kildall died in Monterey, California. He was 52 years old. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The result, authorities concluded, of a fall at a bar. The circumstances were murky enough that those who knew him have always believed the story was incomplete. There was no sustained investigation beyond the initial finding. He had been estranged from many people who might have pushed harder for answers. The industry he built held a brief moment of silence. Microsoft issued a statement. Then everyone went back to work. There is a document that Gary Kildall wrote in his final years, a memoir that was never published, held under seal by his estate. People who have seen portions of it describe it as a meticulous, frustrated reconstruction of every moment where the record had been distorted. He wanted to correct the history. He understood that if he didn't, the version that had already been written, the version in which someone else was the visionary who built the personal computer industry, would stand. That version has largely stood. What the history books typically say is that Gates saw the opportunity, moved fast, and built something enormous. What they typically omit is that the opportunity existed because someone else had already done the foundational work, had already proven that a microprocessor could have an operating system, that individuals could own computers, that software could be the thing that made hardware useful. Kildall proved all of that before IBM came calling, and then he was not in the room when it mattered, for reasons that remain disputed, and someone else was. The lesson that Silicon Valley extracted from this story is about speed and deal-making. Be in the room, move fast, sign the NDA. Those lessons are not wrong, but there is a different lesson that doesn't get told as often. Gary Kildall thought he was building software. Bill Gates understood he was acquiring leverage. Those are two different activities that look almost identical from the outside, and the difference between them is not a technical question. It is a question of what you believe the thing you are building actually is, and what it can become in the hands of someone who sees it differently than you do. The personal computer industry was built on the intellectual foundation that Gary Kildall laid. The financial architecture of that industry was built by someone who understood that the foundation was not enough, that the person who controls the layer between hardware and software controls everything that runs on top. Kildall gave us the concept, Gates gave us the consequence, and somewhere in a sealed archive, there is a document written by the man who should have been the wealthiest person in the world, explaining to no one in particular why he wasn't. If you made it to the end of this one, you already know this channel isn't for everyone. Subscribe, because the next one goes even further behind the door they never opened. Every word of it is true.